It's a break week for the House of Commons, which means cabinet ministers and party leaders are spread out right across the country, laying out their messages and their priorities in the run-up to Tuesday's fall economic statement.
It's a hard balance to strike. Making the necessary investments on one hand, supporting Canadians as we need to do, and at the same time being fiscally responsible.
One, we want the Prime Minister to cancel his plans to quadruple the carbon tax. Two, we want the Prime Minister to announce a plan to balance the budget to bring down interest rates and inflation. And three, we want the Prime Minister to adopt my common sense plan to build homes and not bureaucracy.
We want to make sure that the fall economic statement presented by the government focuses on two things: housing and groceries.
Okay, so we got about 20 sitting days left before Christmas, so it's time to check the pulse of Canadian politics. I'm joined as always on Fridays by Greg McEachern, former Liberal ministerial staffer, now with Can Strategies, Melanie Richer, former Director of Communications for the NDP and now Senior Consultant with Earnscliffe Strategies, and Fred Delory, former Conservative Campaign Manager and Partner at North Star Public Affairs. All right, happy Friday, everyone. Welcome back. Greg, let's just start with a little bit about the FES, as they call it here in Ottawa, the fall economic statement. How does Chrystia Freeland strike that balance she says is so hard to strike?
Well, I think I'd try to meet what the Leader of the Opposition wants. I think they were going to call on building more bureaucracy. And so I'm sure they're changing things over the weekend, working really hard on that. It is the same balance that they've had to do for a while. We put a lot of emphasis on the FES. I think that's because of the pandemic. I think in 1 year it actually replaced the budget, but it's not a budget. We're going to see what people want. It's no secret it's going to be around housing, to a lesser extent around affordability. Sometimes those two areas bleed back and forth. I think they've given us some breadcrumbs around competition and the grocery chains. I'd be watching for that. And this government has a really good relationship with the municipalities, with FCM. They need big cities for political support.
Sure do. Yeah.
What does that mean? Does that mean something around short-term rentals? Those would be the kind of the details. But the big thing is obviously going to be on housing.
Mel, what are you expecting?
Yeah, there's been a theme here on this panel for a few weeks now that we keep saying that the government has been unable to get ahead of stuff, has been unable to get ahead of affordability measures like housing, like grocery prices, and like home heating. I think an opportunity for them in the economic statement is to show that they get it a little bit, to recognize that they haven't answered affordability worries as much as they should have, and while it's not a budget, you can't do everything that you could in a budget. The signaling of understanding that folks are having a hard time and starting to talk about a plan to introduce measures to help folks will, I think, be well received by both New Democrats, but also just regular people watching at home.
Fred, what are your expectations for Tuesday?
I expect we're going to see something that we'll not be talking about a few days later when they forget about it, because that seems to be the consistent message of this Liberal government for the last year.
Look, you're back on Friday, so we're going to have to talk about it then.
Well, we'll see if we even are by then, 3 days after, because this is a government, when they come out with a budget, they come out with a big, and I know this is not a budget, but they come out with these big things, and they brand it, they put a name on it, they talk about it for a few days, and then they seem to forget about it, and they go back into this weird stasis. Mr. Poilievre's going to hammer on his issues on carbon tax and affordability. That's what he's going to want to see, and I think they're going to try to do affordability and inflation somehow. And we'll, at the end of the day, we'll see what's there, and we'll see how long we actually talk about it.
Okay, we will talk about this next Friday to see if people are still talking about it by next Friday. So book that, folks. Is going to happen. And look, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the fall economic statement in this segment, but I want to kind of go through your picks quickly. And Mel, I want to start with yours because you're kind of highlighting something that we will probably see on display on Tuesday, and it goes back to the clip we played of Jagmeet Singh on the top on housing and groceries. What do you got for us?
Yeah, so folks will remember that the first thing that the government put forward in this sitting was a bill that they called affordable homes and grocery prices. That really hasn't gone anywhere. I thought that was a good moment this week for the NDP because they saw the fact that the Conservatives were continuing debate on this and the Liberals really wanted to get this passed and get this done. So they saw it as an opportunity to leverage what they wanted changed in this bill in their conversations with the Liberals. And from what we can tell, in a few news reports today is that it seems like they've been able to get some amendments passed that they're happier with, and they're going to help the government pass this bill. So I thought it was a good proof of showing that there's, New Democrats are still working with Liberals to get stuff done for people, but also that they're being strategic in how they do that and using these opportunities to push the government a little bit further than the government was willing to go.
Greg, it seems to be the pattern that the Liberals put out a piece of legislation and then the NDP leverage it up a little bit, and that's how it goes through, right? Like we saw that in the pandemic, and we're kind of seeing it now, right?
Yeah, and to build on Mel's point, one of the things I'm watching for in the FES is whether or not that's reflected. Is it that bill that's going to be amended, or is there going to be something new? Right. Remember, that bill was to address some of the announcements that Sean Fraser has been making, but also it was in response to when the Competition Bureau looked into the grocery chains. They felt that they didn't have enough teeth, that they couldn't get the information that they needed. So I think, again, something really interesting to watch. That is the government trying to show that they're meeting what people want. To what Fred said earlier, you're absolutely right about the fact that they seem to move on quickly. Yeah. What they were supposed to do out of the London Summer Caucus was stay on housing, and they seem to be staying on housing.
Yeah, they have had a more consistent focus on it. But Fred, what's your reaction to the Housing and Grocery Coalition coming together with the deal on this legislation?
Well, it's Christmas season, and I feel like I'm watching a Hallmark movie here, where, in the fall we had the Liberals and NDP put in 2 separate bills, and 2 months later they finally get together and have a bill. It's been playing out in front of us. This is the supply and confidence agreement. It's not a coalition, but it is. And the only way any of these bills were going to pass by the Liberals is with the NDP support. So we were going to get to this point eventually. It just took 2 months. I don't know why they didn't try to bang something out earlier.
Okay, so Greg, Fred is right. It is. We're getting into the Christmas season, and you wanted to talk about, I guess, a new present that has been unwrapped by the government of Canada this week.
And not just because a lot of those Christmas movies are filmed here in Ottawa, but I thought it was really interesting to note this week that the Prime Minister of Canada, and that's not Justin Trudeau, that's all Prime Ministers of Canada, will now have a new plane. You've probably been on that plane.
The old one, yes.
The old one, and it was not in great shape. There was a 2-day delay in India earlier this fall. There's been other times where it's had to return to airports because of problems. I'm told that you had to string like power cords down the aisles, things like that. And I remember in early 2018...
I just have to stop for a second. These pictures we're showing, that's the new plane. I have never flown in anything resembling that comfort. Sorry, continue your point, Greg.
Absolutely. Yeah. Early 2018, Prime Minister Trudeau did a speech at the Ronald Reagan Museum in California, and there's a decommissioned Air Force One there. And I'm told the Prime Minister was looking at it and realizing that Ronald Reagan had better communications access in the early 80s than the Prime Minister of Canada did in 2018. What I like about this is that we didn't do our usual Canadian pearl clutching, I can't believe we spent money. I feel like I'm going to wake up one day to a story that 24 Sussex has tumbled down the hill into the river because we can't seem to decide on that. And I really hope that and again, I guess in terms of the Christmas season, that we start to look at, whether it's Stornoway or 24 Sussex or the plane, that this is for our leaders and not for our partisan leaders.
Yeah. Yeah, and Mel, look, it is a great privilege to fly on the Prime Minister's plane. I've gotten to do it, I'd say, about a dozen times since I've been in Ottawa. It is not a luxury. That plane, I think Brian Mulroney bought those used. They're kind of that old,
There's not parts available for them anymore. That's part of the problem.
There's no TV screens, there's no plugs, there's no anything. It's and they take forever and they break down all the time. But these are used, I think, as well.
They're about 8 years old.
Yeah,
and I think
they're new to Canada.
Yeah.
But Mel, it wasn't the usual sort of rancor, as Greg points out, which is kind of surprising.
Yeah.
Maybe we can have nice things.
Totally, maybe we can. I think that's exactly it. It's nice to see a story that's like, oh, there's nothing to see here. Of course, the Prime Minister should have a safe and reliable aircraft to travel to the events that he needs to go to. And I think that's a good point to tie it to 24 Sussex, to Stornoway. If we want our leaders to be seen as serious, I think we need to make sure that they have stuff that is reliable. So glad that he has this new plane. And to your point, I think it's important to stress that it's not for our partisan leaders, but it's for our prime ministers. So I think that that's a good thing, that this was scandal-free this week.
A senior member of the Prime Minister's staff used to joke when we go on these trips that the plane was vintage, and the Canada was showing up like hipsters, right? People with turntables.
Vintage.
But Fred, not even a peep from the Conservatives. I mean, I guess when you're 14 points up in the polls, and you might get to fly this thing.
Those are
Yeah.
our planes.
Those are our planes.
We've got eyes on those planes in a year or two. Those are, Mr. Poilievre's going to be flying in those. And same, please fix 24 Sussex. But at the end of the day, it's really about, I think, discipline. It's lazy going after these issues because they don't move votes when you do it. You may get a headline, it doesn't matter. Poilievre and the Conservatives are hammering on issues that actually resonate, and that's why we're seeing the 14-point lead in the polls, wherever they are. It's because they have a message that's consistent, and really every member of the team is singing from the same book, and that's why it's working well for them. Hitting on affordability, carbon tax, all these other issues. Once you go offside and start talking about this stuff, you're wasting air.
Right. Okay. So, which I guess brings us to your topic. It fits in with the climate agenda. It's the plastic ban and the court decision. I mean, what's your take on that?
This was a ridiculous policy the Liberals brought in the first place. It was incredibly unpopular. I remember my kids coming home from school, who were obviously not politically engaged, coming back upset that Justin Trudeau's taken our straws away, and it was this weird thing that I left my phone on. And it was one of these, just a really bad policy. And Trudeau's legacy, I thought when he was going to be done, was going to be his environmental policy. We're seeing they've already watered down their carbon tax with some of the stuff they're removing. And now we're seeing the courts overturning the straw. I just don't see what the legacy is going to be coming from him when this is all said and done.
So, my kids have reusable rubber straws and steel straws. I mean, they've made that adjustment. I don't know. I mean, but Fred has a point here, Greg. It's a bunch of things that emerged from that climate consensus in 2015, 2016, either now watered down, thrown out, or need to be revisited in some ways, and at a time when they're not in the strongest political position to try to salvage it.
Yeah, and it's funny when we're pressed, we were very much in favor of the environment. To paraphrase an old beer ad, those who like it a lot in terms of green initiatives in this government. They have a good voting base there. They've had a good voting base there. But now, post-pandemic, all the issues that we have, inflation, all of a sudden people are kind of like pulling back a bit. I don't want to use single-use plastics. I live in Ottawa. We have bi-monthly garbage pickup, but we have compost weekly and recyclables weekly. And we have a landfill in Ottawa that is near full, and that is going to cost me and other taxpayers here a lot more money. So yes, I compost because I learned how to do it when I was a kid, because we had a garden, but it makes sense that there's less stuff going into that landfill. And I heard the Leader of the Opposition today talk about how are we going to keep food fresh? And it's a straw man argument, or a paper straw man argument. I'll see myself out. Has the man ever?
One of those.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, man. Has the man ever heard of Tupperware? But again, these positions were popular, and I think a lot of people don't have an issue with getting rid of single-use plastics. I wish the government had a better job of this so that the courts were not sending it back to them.
Mel, how do you think that, I mean, they're probably going to appeal this. I mean, it's certainly the message from Stephen Guilbeault, but there is this, you look at Saskatchewan now threatening to withhold carbon. There is a fraying of the consensus, and as the political dynamic has completely shifted in the country.
Yeah, well, especially on this issue of affordability and how sometimes we're asking folks to pay a little bit more to help fight the climate crisis, and it's usually those folks who are having a hard time making ends meet. So I think with to your point, with the anger or the frustration, this is almost like, oh, well, here's proof that this is making our life harder, which is really too bad, because this was something that the NDP had pushed for years on the single-use plastic. And what I found interesting from the return from the courts was the fact that they were too broad on plastics. So to your point, if they had been maybe more specific on what exactly that looked like in the banning of single-use plastics, maybe we wouldn't be here. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. And if there's still a path to reduce single-use plastics to really help our environment.
Okay, we got about 3 minutes left. I do want to go back to the fall economic statement. Fred, I want to pick up on your point about how they throw out their budgets and then they throw out their budgets. People stop talking about it very quickly. I think this budget this year was a little bit different because it had the response to the Inflation Reduction Act, and we're seeing that with Volkswagen and, the battery deals and all these sorts of things. But you're right that and Liberals have complained about this because my sense has always been they're always about a billion things rather than one or two or three things. Tuesday, if it's more heavily on housing and fixing finances, could that be something we are talking about next Friday?
It could be if they have a theme that we keep talking about, and if all of their MPs and spinners and all are out there saying the same story and telling the same story. The last time the Conservatives were really functioning well, where we won an election, was in 2011. We had Canada's Economic Action Plan from 2008 to 2011. It's the only thing we said. We kept talking about that. Every statement we made was to drive that home. Every single announcement had some element of the Canada's Economic Action Plan. And that's what the Liberals desperately need if they want to get back on track.
So Greg, I mean, you think we'll see that on Tuesday? Susan Delacourt was on the show earlier talking about how, to deliver on some of the things the NDP wants, maybe their credit rating is in jeopardy here, right? It's problematic. So maybe it forces them to be focused and more disciplined.
Yeah, and I just had a flashback to the Economic Action Plan. Those big checks that we all made fun of. Well, the carbon price rebates go in people's accounts and they don't know that they're there.
Yeah.
So I'm starting to rethink those giant checks.
Novelty checks have survived for a long time for a reason,
Paul Martin changed the way budgets were delivered, and they were communicated really, really strongly. And that has kind of set an expectation. And during the Conservative years, I remember when there was a budget that didn't have a lot really in it, but Jim Flaherty got rid of the penny. I called it a literal shiny object of distraction because people talked about that aspect of it. But this government has never, ever been able to use the budget, for example, as a good communications tool. But again, coming out of London, the caucus, this was the thing that they were supposed to stay focused on housing and not get distracted. And we'll see if that happens on Tuesday.
Mel, they do seem aware of that deficiency since the summer caucus and all the frank conversations. Chrystia Freeland's far more visible as finance minister domestically than she's been. I mean, what do you expect? Do you expect to see a sharper, more tightly focused message on Tuesday?
I think the runway is getting shorter and shorter for them not to. So I don't really think that they have a choice not to come out and be sharp. And again, talk about things that people want to hear or people are looking to get addressed. So I think that'll be super important. And the discipline aspect, I think, is a really good point. As we work towards elections, when you put out a platform, there's always a million and one things in there. But what's important is that you continue to talk about the one thing so people know really what you are putting on the table in the next election. And I think in the runway to the next election, it'll be important for the Liberals to figure out what that one thing is and have a good solution to it. And hopefully they can, hopefully for them, they start doing that on Tuesday.
Yeah, and we've got to say goodbye, but there's things they can seize on that they don't, right? Like TD Bank put out some data on housing. We're 20% above pre-pandemic levels in housing starts. Right. Why am I hearing that from the bank and not from the government of Canada? You know what I mean? All right. I want to thank Melanie Richer, Fred Delory, and Greg McEachern. They're going to be joining us on Tuesday as we cover the fall economic statement.